There's a generation that grew up without smartphones, without social media, and sometimes without their parents at home in the afternoon. A generation that learned to be independent not because it was trendy, but because it was necessary. They were the kids who came home to empty houses, made their own snacks, and figured things out on their own. And strangely, that experience shaped a mindset that still influences how they work, think, and live today. This is the psychology of Generation X, the generation that quietly built resilience while the world was busy watching everyone else. Generation X, generally born between the mid-1960s and early 1980s, grew up in a time of massive cultural shifts. Divorce rates were rising, both parents often worked, and technology was just beginning to creep into daily life. Many of them became what people later called latchkey kids. Now, that might sound a bit dramatic, but psychologically, it had a powerful effect. When you learn early that no one is constantly supervising you, you develop a strong sense of independence. You become resourceful. You stop waiting for permission. And this independence became one of Generation X's greatest strengths. Studies on autonomy and motivation consistently show that people who develop self-reliance early tend to be better problem solvers and more adaptable in uncertain environments. Generation X often carries this mindset into adulthood. They're practical, realistic, and usually not easily impressed by hype. While other generations might chase trends, Gen X tends to sit back and think, all right, but does this actually work? There's also a certain skepticism in this generation, and honestly, it makes sense. They grew up during economic recessions, corporate layoffs, and rapid changes in the job market. They learned that stability isn't guaranteed. So, psychologically, many of them developed a trust but verify attitude toward institutions, media, and even authority. They don't just accept what they're told, they question it. In today's world, that trait can be incredibly valuable. But every strength has a shadow side. That same independence can sometimes turn into emotional distance. When you're used to handling everything alone, asking for help doesn't come naturally. Some members of Generation X struggle with vulnerability because, growing up, being tough wasn't optional, it was survival. And while resilience is powerful, carrying everything alone can be exhausting. There's also the tendency toward cynicism. When you've seen promises broken enough times, it's easy to expect disappointment by default. Psychologists sometimes call this defensive pessimism, a mindset where expecting the worst feels safer than hoping for the best. It protects you from being blindsided, but it can also make joy feel a little muted, like watching a movie with the brightness turned down. Another interesting psychological trait of Generation X is their relationship with work. Many of them value stability, but they're also deeply aware that companies aren't always loyal to employees. So, instead of blind loyalty, they often develop a quiet pragmatism. Do your job well, get paid, and keep your options open. Not flashy, not dramatic, just practical. Kind of like that one friend who always brings a power bank while everyone else is at 5% battery, panicking. Yet perhaps the most fascinating thing about Generation X is how balanced they tend to be. They grew up in an analog childhood but adapted to a digital adulthood. They remember cassette tapes and streaming platforms, handwritten letters, and instant messaging. Psychologically, this makes them excellent bridges between generations. They understand the past, but they're not completely disconnected from the future. And maybe that's their quiet superpower. Generation X isn't always loud. They don't always dominate headlines or trends. But beneath that calm, often understated exterior is a generation shaped by independence, realism, and resilience. They learn to stand on their own feet early, to think critically, and to adapt when the ground shifted beneath them. And in a world that changes faster every year, those might be some of the most valuable psychological traits anyone can have.